All right, good day to all of you. Welcome to Practical Research 1. And for today's topic, we'll be discussing the importance of scope and delimitation of research. And that's going to be for our lesson 12. And for today's lesson, I want to set your expectation in class that, of course, what we're going to talk about is basically more on scope and the limitations. And of course, my objective is to understand um, the importance and the function of the scope and the limitation of your research. And at the same time, we will be needing also to define what is scope and what is the limitation. So at the end of this discussion, I am hoping that all of you can able to write your own scope and delimitation. That is actually based on your own study, all right? Or yung topic that you are exploring about, all right? So without any further ado, class, let's talk about this one, all right? So scope and delimitation of research class, it is very important to set the parameters of your study, right? That is what are included and what are not. This speaks about the scope and delimitation of your research. So all of us class, there are times that we can say that we have our own boundaries, right? We set our own boundaries. And the reason why we set our boundaries because that measure how far we can go through, or that measure of of your patience sometimes. Pag lumalagpas na doon sa sinet mo na boundaries, hindi ka na okay, no? So same with scope and delimitation of research class. Sometimes you have to put not really sometimes, all the time when you are making your research, because it will give a hint to the audience or the one that reading your research that this is the only variables that you can see, or you are setting an expectation also to them what are the variables that they can read throughout your research. All right, so nagre-revolve lang siya around doon. Okay, so scope and delimitation of research class study are two elements of a research paper that inform the reader what information is included in the research, and of course explain why the author choose that information. So you are the author of your own research, and of course you are the one who has a power, right? Who has a power to choose um certain boundaries. But of course there are certain guidelines, right, that you have of how far you can go through on what are the other things that you have to consider in order to make sure that the other variables, diba, lalo na yung mga importante, hindi ba compromise. All right, although scope and delimitation explain the way a study is limited, this information adds credibility to research in the sense that you are not entertaining a lot of things or a lot of topics all at once, no? So maganda to because you may probably give a justice to the topic that that you are chosen, and at the same time it will give a credibility to research since you are very focused on that particular topic. All right, so when we say scope, the scope of a study is a section of a research paper that explain the information or subject is being analyzed, right? So this is the time self-explanatory where explanation and analysis taken place, especially if you want to understand certain variables, no? Or whatever characters or mas maganda yung term na variables na makikita natin in the research. Okay, so if at the beginning of the study it is already clear that your respondents are the regular employees who have been working the agency for at least 3 years, are presently connected with the agency, and have been assigned for at least 3 provinces in the central Luzon, then all those who do not meet the above description should not be part of the study. So if you have something like that, it was mentioned there, the variables, especially the employees who, it answered the question who, it's also answered the question when, I'm sorry, where, right, and what, okay? So likewise, it is clear that that only selected variables are included and no other variables supposed to be part of the study. Even these were included in parallel studies. You might also avoided other variables for reason or practically, interest, or relatively to the study at hand. All right, so that's the importance of scope. Now let's talk about the limitation class. The delimitation of the study is the explanation of the scope of the study. So this is the time where you explain that situation. So uh, aside from showing the variables that you have, this is the time where you explain the functions of those, no? And explaining the reason behind. This section allows the writer to explain why a certain aspect of a subject were chosen and why others were excluded. So in the limitation class, all are whys, no? Yung mga tanong natin, bakit? Ganyan. So this is the time this is the place or the section of a research paper where also explaining the reason why, okay? And that's the limitation. It is also common for a writer to explain the chosen research method and this section and explain why certain theories were applied to the data. That's according to reference.com in the year 2017. So basically, class, it's self-explanatory. All you have to remember is all our whys, no? Yung mga question natin why, bakit yan yung mga napili nating mga variables or bakit yan yung nandoon sa inyong scope. Then the limitation function is to explain the reason behind on it or why you choose that or why everything, all the whys. No? So next we have the difference between limitations and delimitations. What are the difference between limitations and delimitation? So we all know, class, that limitations are influences that the researcher cannot control. So it has something to do with uh, uh, beyond your control. Like, I mean, when we say that you cannot control something that it's not include in your own power to, to whatever you did, uh, walang mangyayari kasi just like what I said, this is something that cannot be controlled. So there are times that the shortcomings or conditions or influences cannot be controlled by the researcher that place restrictions on your methodology and conclusions. So any limitations that might influence the results should be mentioned. So according to develop research proposal planning, the methodology limitations and the limitations in the year 2017 as part of my sources here or my source here. So having said that, when we say that limitation, again, I want to reiterate that one more time because I think I haven't explained it well. So when we say the limitation, aside from saying that this is something that you cannot control, right? There are also study, no, na meron naman nakalagay doon na scope and limitations. No? If that's the case, then ginagamit nila ito for this reason, no? for this explanation. There are things that they cannot control. However, it's still important to go through with their study despite of that. And that's why if they put this limitation in order to understand that there are certain limitation as well, that despite of what they did, yun talaga ang nangyari. Okay? So, for example, one of the factors or one of the reasons of the limitations or possible limitations that may arise in the research is in the question of sample size. Now, so the research design and methodology will determine whether the research will have a small or a large sample size. So the sample size will determine the quality of data and the relationship that will be identified among variables. So the common design that they use is we do have the qualitative and quantitative research design. And usually, class, they have a different function as well, right? And it is very important, yung mga grade 12 ngayon, they're having a hard time or they're having a difficulty of determining their sample size, you know. And because of that, class, so the reason why it's still included in the sample size, because somehow a confusion of the how they determine. So usually there are ways in order to get the right sample size that you needed in your own study. So I think we have a discussion or separate discussion for that. Usually pag nandun na tayo sa mga chapter 4 or chapter 5 of your research, kahit na sa chapter 3, pwede na natin pag-usapan yan. Alright? Secondly, we do have the lack of available and or reliable data. So missing and unreliable data will limit the scope of analysis and the ability of the researcher to determine meaningful trends and relationship among the data. You know, you could have done this, or you could have avoided this one if you know the certain boundaries. I mean, certain boundaries. You could have avoided this to happen if from the very beginning you already determine the topic that you have, because there are a lot of consideration. Maybe your topic is too narrow, or maybe your topic is, too broad. So there are certain characteristic or consideration when you choose your topic. So I think in that way we can lessen the problem along the way if everything or in each section of your research paper you think about it. No? So number 3, lack of prior studies. This will limit the effectiveness of the literature review and may limit the initial understanding of the research problem. So this, however, can be a basis for identifying avenues for future research. You know, lack of prior study. Sometimes we came up with this topic because this is something that we interested about, right? That's why we came up with that topic. But the problem is, along the way, we are, what do you call this one? We discredit the fact uh, that you have to read a review or a lot of review-related literature for you to be able to come up a good topic. Because in that way, there is an evidences that there were studies that will be part of your sources and at the same time a basis of your study, right? And number 4, chosen data collection method. So limitation in the data collection instrument may affect the quality of data collected. Unclear or vague questions in a questionnaire will result to unclear or erroneous answer from the respondents. All right, so they saying here that there's a vague questions, meaning malabo or hindi malinaw, no, unclear questionnaire. So this limitation in the data collection instrument, no, yung sa ginagamit natin na mga survey questions, something like that, it could probably, what can I say that? Meaning pwedeng possible na magkaroon ng error or mali. The method employed in data collection may also affect the data. For example, the researcher may have conducted an interview or survey at a time. The respondents may be busy or preoccupied. There may be possibility that the respondents may not have accomplished the survey form or answered the question thoroughly, and the responses given may have been vague. All right. So because well, this is not your fault already, no? But the fact that there's a consideration as well on how to make there's still like there are also characteristic to make a good survey question so that your researcher would understand the question and would not be problematic on their end, 'di ba? Kasi ang tendency kasi baka medyo mahirap yung mga tanong natin. Kaya ang nangyayari wala na siya ng gana, and secondly, di na naintindihan the questions. And another factors to that, since mentioned here that they were busy or preoccupied at that time, so there are tendencies that they will answer it the way that they wanted. Like they don't think about it; they just wanted to finish and then submit it. No? So in that way, that answer could probably bag, especially if your research is in a qualitative form where, di ba, yung survey natin na pang questions about sa qualitative form where it's really hard to interpret that sometimes. So there, no, nagkakaroon ng problem. So what I could have done better in order to avoid this, let's have a separate discussion also when it comes to questions or how to make a good survey questions. Okay, and the nature of the information collected. So relying on a pre-existing data may impose limits on the researcher as she cannot longer clarify a certain data. So I think this one is self-explanatory. So those five that I just mentioned is also part of the limitation class. So now we have, apart from the data and methodology, the characteristic of the researcher and the limits that she experiences in the conduct of the research may also give a rise to the limitations. So these are follows. We do have access. So the amount and quality of data will depend on the availability of the researcher to access people, organizations, libraries, documents that can provide him or her the best available data. So sometimes we're limited. I don't know. In your own case, right? Because it says here limitation or no access or accessibility to any sources, either a primary or secondary sources, just to I mean sources for you to be able to complete or to gather whatever information that you need to. Okay, so I think it's your availability as a researcher. So just like what I said before you started, uh, your before you come up with study or thesis title or title of your research, you have to think it very well so that you can able to assess those kind of weaknesses that we have mentioned. There is a study that there are some studies class that it's really hard to search for, like for example, is that controversial topic, mga ganyan, or anything that talks about that. It's really hard to find our source of to find the sources or any previous studies associated with it. Then don't make a time don't what do you call this one, wag natin ituloy, no? Don't be harsh to yourself. So we do have the time period. The length of time devoted to the study will affect almost all aspects of the research. It is advisable to select a research problem and design that gives away a more manageable time and period. And bias class, no? Bias. No? Sometimes it's really hard to avoid this kind of character in ourselves, no? But as a researcher, you need to be blunt and you need to be fair. So we have to avoid being biased in all aspects, right? So this refers to a way of reviewing certain thing like issues or idea and may be influenced by the researcher background. So the researcher therefore should be aware of his or her personal biases and how this affect the conduct of the research. So this will become a problematic on your end if you yourself, you know, if you yourself cannot avoid to be biased at all. So meaning when you make a research or when you make a study, whatever it is, do not manipulate just to satisfy or, just to satisfy yourself because this is what you want to happen. So you have to avoid that because biases may affect the way the researcher states and defines the research problem, the selection of research design and methodology, the variable chosen, data collection methods, and the interpretation of data. If there is a biases, if you cannot avoid that, then there is a manipulation to your study. Then therefore, how can we say that your topic has a credibility, right? That makes sense. Number four, language. This may have an effect on data collection, especially if the researcher is involved with respondents that speak a variety of languages. Here in our country class, whatever legal forms or tama ba, yung mga legal na mga letter, ganyan, lagi nakasulat in English, no? So sometimes there were respondents na hindi naman sila ganun ka educated and they don't know how to speak English as well, no? So you as a researcher, you have to consider your target populations, um, their capability, to understand or to answer your survey questions. Do not use any complex or technical or very complicated sentences that may probably tend to anong tawag dyan, di na sasagutan, di naiintindihan eh, di ba? So something like that. Or pag binasa pa lang, medyo nahihirapan na parang feeling nila nag-exam sila or nag-take sila ng licensure examination because of your survey question, no? So you have to consider that, especially na mga nasa provinces natin, may mga ganyang cases na hindi talaga marunong magbasa, hindi magsulat. So you have to understand the variety of people, okay? Especially the language that you use. If you like to, you have to explain it in English and Tagalog. So nakuha niyo yung punto class. Yun lang yung binibigyan tayo kasi kung Pilipino yung subject mo, tapos English yung subject mo. So it's another giving us a limitation to use certain languages because we cannot target whatever language na pwede nilang maintindihan. Hindi natin alam as a researcher kung ano yung language din na pwede nilang maintindihan. And that limits our capability, no? To determine whatever language appropriate in there so that they can able to understand. Kaya nandyan siya sa limitation. Under pa rin siya ng limitation. And of course, let's talk about delimitation. What is delimitation class? It addresses how the study will be narrowed in scope. This is how it is bounded. So again, class, sana naintindihan natin yung limitation. No? At mga pinakita ko sa inyo ng mga situations, circumstances, it gives or it limits us as a researcher, no? Something that beyond our control, something that we cannot do, no? Something that we cannot do, regardless of whatever we did. We cannot change the fact that not all na pwede nating anong tawag dito, na pwede nating makuha lahat or ang tawag natin dyan, no? Na ma-solve natin lahat in that particular aspect. So, language pa nga lang eh, di ba? Language pa lang yung pinag-uusapan natin. We are living in the country where we're composed of many dialects, can I say that? And of course, dahil nga Pilipino tayo, no, we consider that we can speak both English and Tagalog. No? Pero paano naman yung mga ibang or local dialect din, no? Tapos hindi sila nakapag-aral, no? So, this is what I'm talking about. Nagsisimula talaga yan sa paghanap natin ng ating research title. I think let's start there. It's very important that you can determine already in your research title what are the topics that we have to avoid and what are the topics that could be easier in our part because there were previous studies, it's accessible, the informations that you want, and of course, your target would be able to understand whatever dialect that you may use, whether it's Tagalog or English, no? So there. But what do you mean by a delimitation class? So a delimitation, it addresses how the study will be narrowed in scope. That is how it is bounded. This is the place to explain the things that you are not doing and why you have chosen not to do them. So the literature you will not review. And why not? The population you are not studying, and why not? The methodological procedures you will not use and why will not use them. Limit your delimitations to the things that a reader might reasonably expect you to do not. But you, for clearly explained reasons, you have decided not to do so. That's according to Siddiqui in 2010. So a delimitation class, this is something that, again, explaining the reason why you put all those variables on the scope, right? That's what we discussed earlier. So since we're talking about here addresses how the study will be narrowed down. So basically, class, ganyan natin ang gate kung hanggang saan lang yung property na pwede nating or distance kung gaano lang kalayo din ang ating pwedeng tahakin sa ating studies, no? That's around or evolved to the scope that you just said. So for example, there's one class. This is the place to explain the things. Now, the reason why, kung bakit hindi natin sinasama si ganito, bakit hindi natin kailangan isama yung ganyang particular na topic, that is because beyond to your scope. Okay. So how do indicates the scope and the limitation of the study? Simply start with any of these sample phrases that expresses the scope of the study. First, you may say the coverage of the study. Secondly, the study consists of, and the study covers that. In that way, you may probably have a signals, or you have this kind of phrases that will tell us already that you are starting to make the limitations. All right. So next, step two, explain what information or subject being studied or analyzed. And next, explain the limitation of the research, like the sample size, time frame, geographical area, subject, objectives, facilities, and the issues to which the research is focused. And step three, start with any of the sample phrases that express the limitation of the study. The study does not cover the, and the researcher limited this research to, the study is limited to, and step four, describe the scope of the study, explain why definite aspect of a subject were chosen and why other were excluded, and mention the research method used as well as the certain theories that apply to the data, and explain why you are delimiting the research to aspect geographical location, age, population size, and other similar considerations. Sorry about that. And last, we have to identify the constraint or weaknesses of your research, which are not within the control of the researcher. So if you have explained it well, then therefore your research become more interesting, and at the same time there is a credibility to that because we were able to talk, or we were able to justify all the angles, the reason why not, and all of the things that your audience expected to do so. So basically, that scope and delimitations class giving you or setting an expectation to your audience or to the readers. So scope and delimitation example from actual studies, I'll give you one, but I'll show you another example class from a, I think I have to post it on your screen now so that everyone can see it. Now, title of the study, experiences of the reaction and coping of Filipino fathers and mothers during after a national disaster. So nakikita niyo yung mga gumawa dyan. That is the year in 2015. Those are the author. So what are the one that I included here? For example, this one class. The study covers individual experiences as coping of Filipino fathers and mothers. It will focus on individuals who are affected by natural disaster, specifically those affected by floods due to typhoons, Undoy, and Habagat, because they believe that the typhoons had the most significant impact on people's lives. So this severity of the impact of this typhoon was so tragic that the research participants were able to instinctively recall informations and their experiences that happened during the events. This research focused on the perspective of fathers and mothers. Another limitation of the research was the area covered, wherein the researcher focused only on Filipino participants who resided in the National Capital Region NCR during and after the typhoon struck. So kindly study this one class. I'll give you an opportunity to study this one. If all the signals that I gave you or the steps to create a scope and delimitation is already in here. So you can comment or you can just ask me a question tomorrow before we start our formal lesson. Before we proceed to other lessons, we wanted to make sure that everyone is on the same page and we both understand what is the concept of scope and delimitation. All right. So I hope you learned something for today. Thank you so much. I hope all of you have a great day. Bye bye for now.